So I should begin by saying that this research paper that I wrote is not so much about the history of psychology as it is inspired by the history of psychology. I've been self-censoring for 2 years now because I've been too scared for one reason or another to ask questions about the things that are happening in the world. It was only after reading about the origins of psychology and the history of science that I felt justified in my curiosity. After spending a few weeks really interacting with and reading and writing about Socrates, I've been able to muster up the courage to ask my questions. I'm seeing some disturbing similarities between trespasses of the past that are now being repeated. In the world's current ongoing pandemic, there are many questions that people have that are going unanswered or ignored or brushed off as ignorant. The COVID pandemic has had massive sweeping impacts on all realms of life, and while there's nothing that's gone unimpacted, there are changes that I have seen in the presentation of science that I think need to be addressed. When I say the presentation of science, I'm not referring to all scientists or all scientific studies. What I'm referring to is the presentation of science as presented to the mainstream media, to the public. And for the sake of brevity now, I will have to refer to the presentation of science as POS from this point on. It just worked out that way, right? Throughout the pandemic, the leading scientist that the people in the United States have looked to for guidance has been Dr. Anthony Fauci. While there are many doctors and many scientists that are all investigating multiple aspects of this pandemic, Dr. Fauci has been the spokesperson that is seen on the news broadcasts and is viewed by the general public as the spokesperson for science. When there's a medical emergency, we would hope that the information we receive from trusted sources would be, well, trustworthy. The discourse surrounding the POS right now is concerning for many reasons. There's a tone of absolutism, intense group polarization, a lack of humility, and censorship on a scale that I've never seen in my lifetime. In the early days of the scientific revolution, curiosity was not considered a virtue, and on the contrary, curiosity could get you denigrated, excommunicated, and even killed. Socrates was sentenced to die for asking questions, Hypatia was murdered for committing multiple heresies, Galileo was excommunicated and his research was destroyed. Many examples of vilification, ostracism, and corporal punishments are written about in educational books in every field. In my readings of these histories, I'm drawing some concerning parallels to what is happening currently between the POS and the treatment of its new heretics. Socrates, Hypatia, and Galileo were all punished in various ways for different reasons. One reason that's central to all their fates is they're all labeled as heretics. Words like heretic, infidel, and blasphemer sound almost quaint today to both atheists and believers, and one reason that one might scoff or chuckle at somebody accusing them of heresy now is only because, absent punishment, being called a heretic really has no actual meaning for the person, apart from knowing that someone else vehemently disagrees with them. While derogatory terms change and lose their meaning over time, there are always new ones that fill their place. If one disagrees with or even questions COVID protocols or COVID vaccines, one is labeled as anti-vaxxer or anti-science. Now, absent punishment, these demeaning labels have little to no physical power. However, as group polarization is exacerbated and dichotomous groups' animosity grows stronger, those same people can be labeled now as domestic terrorists. News outlets are publishing op-eds saying that persons who are still asking questions about COVID vaccines are the equivalent to domestic terrorists. While heretic and anti-vaxxer are not backed with the threat of corporal punishment, a label of domestic terrorist does have the power of the state to punish trespassers. History has shown that persons averse to accept the authority of the church were first stigmatized by the church, then punished by the state. In current times, thinking differently and refusing to accept the authority of the POS is also what it takes to be currently stigmatized and soon punished by the state. These labels are counterproductive for the advancement of communications for multiple reasons. One problem with calling people anti-science or anti-vaccine is that labels can become self-fulfilling. For individuals hoping for others to come around to the scientific side of thinking, to call them anti-science is going to convince them to stop being heretics, isn't going to stop them from being heretics. If anything, these individuals might accept and internalize the label and become vehemently anti-science in ways that perhaps they would not have. This goes for anti-vaxxer as well. There are many people who are in favor of vaccines in general, but have questions about this vaccine. Labeling these people anti-vaxxer may also become a self-fulfilling prophecy in that they will question the efficacy and integrity of other vaccines based on their treatment for asking questions about this one. Another form of denigrating someone is to discredit them or make them appear foolish as a way to silence or shame them. Recently, the POS latched onto a story about Joe Rogan, a famous comedian who ingested a horse dewormer to beat COVID. This horse dewormer they're referring to is actually a pharmaceutical called ivermectin that won the Nobel Prize in 2015 for its highly effective use in a broad spectrum of diseases in humans with minimal adverse events. This misnomer of calling a Nobel Prize-winning drug that's also on the WHO's list of essential medicines a horse dewormer elicits some concerning hypotheses. While the media at large cannot be expected to actually be the spokespeople for science, they can at least look to scientists to correct them. Or a quick search on Google would reveal that although there are versions of ivermectin that are for horses, just as there are versions of Benadryl that are for cats, the drug ivermectin has been shown to be effective in treating a wide range of RNA and some DNA viruses such as Zika, dengue, yellow fever, and others. In addition to being antiparasitic, it has also been shown to be antiviral, antimicrobial, and anti-inflammatory properties. In fact, many doctors have used ivermectin to treat the symptoms of COVID-19, and several studies have been conducted showing promising results and recommending more clinical trials for the possible off-label use of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID. Yet, despite there being enough peer-reviewed studies to do a meta-analysis for the efficacy and use of ivermectin to treat COVID, the POS Dr. Fauci has publicly stated that there is no clinical evidence that this works. This is empirically untrue. This is a worldwide pandemic, and it stands to reason that we would want to be searching for lots of different ways to curtail this disease. The easily confirmable untruth that's circulating about ivermectin as both having no value and as strictly being a horse dewormer poses a problem for those on the side of science hoping to advocate for science. Why are alternative and effective treatments for this disease being ignored or demeaned? One possibility is that the spokesperson for science is unaware of ongoing studies into alternative treatments, and also seemingly unaware that ivermectin has won a Nobel Prize and is on the WHO's essential medicines list. If this is the case, that is troubling, as one would hope that the experts in treating a disease that's crippling the world would be informed on all possible treatments. If they don't know about the studies that are easily accessed on Google Scholar, that would call into question the credibility of the speaker. If the omission of the data was perpetrated with intent, then it would call into question the speaker's implicit bias at best and ill intentions at worst, which again is problematic. The POS should be curious about all theories and potential treatments. It is curiosity that has led to the success of the scientific method. These few examples of denigration, which were prevalent means of exerting authority before the scientific revolution as a way for the presenters of religion to maintain obedience, is antithetical to the spirit of science. In sociology, this open and accepted use of pejorative language to describe others that people disagree with would be what Zimbardo would call engaging in a two-category world of good people like us and bad people like them. And while some may say sticks and stones and not give much attention to name-calling, it is not uncommon for the systematic devaluing of other humans and others to precipitate more violent actions that are justified based on the notion that it's justified to deny others humanity. As Milgram wrote, people were excluded from the category of citizen and national and were finally denied the status of human beings. Systematic devaluation of the victim provides a psychological justification for the brutal treatment of the victim and has been at the constant accompaniment of massacres, pogroms, and wars. Now, this has become a mainstay in the presentation of science. You either are a believer in science or you're a modern-day heretic. There have been many points in this pandemic where the public was presented with science that was quickly updated. On Meet the Press, Dr. Fauci laments that criticism he bore from individuals who were frustrated or confused by initial recommendations to first not wear masks, then to wear masks, then to wear 2 masks. Dr. Fauci said that his perceived flip-flopping was simply due to the fact that he changed his opinion when new facts were presented. This is in line with the spirit of science. According to the way that I understand the scientific process, based on what you know at a given time, when the data changes, it's essential to change your position. You have to be guided by the issues in the current data. To quote Neglected Perspective, scientific claims are open to change and sometimes quick to change. Nothing is immutable, infallible, ironclad, or written in stone for all time and all circumstances. It is accepted, or rather expected, that there will forever be a different interpretation, a fresh perspective, a whole new organization of facts, or even a debate about what counts as a fact. Pedestalized authority is contrary to the very spirit of science. Pedestalized authority is contrary to the very spirit of science. This is in opposition to remarks made by the POS on Meet the Press in June. Dr. Fauci stated that attacks on me are attacks on science. Science and the truth are being attacked. This absolutist language is the opposite of what I understand science to be. The scientific community should understand why people who are anti-science are becoming distrustful when the rhetoric of the POS is sounding like the authoritarian absolutism employed by the presentation of a religion against science in its infancy. Rational authority not only permits but requires constant scrutiny and criticism of those subjected to it. It is always temporary. Its acceptance depends on its performance. The source of irrational authority, on the other hand, is always power over people. Power on the one side, fear on the other. Criticism of the authority is not only not required, but forbidden. In the spirit of science, this acceptance of updating beliefs based on new information gives merit to the concerns of individuals who are still unsure about the safety and efficacy of this vaccine. There have been numerous instances of drugs being pulled off the market, sometimes years after they've been approved by the FDA, as long-term data can be collected and synthesized in new conclusions about their safety or lack thereof. From bloodlettings to frontal lobotomies, doctors and new medical procedures have often resulted in as much harm as good. Most recently, Chantix, which is a Pfizer drug, was pulled off the market after being in circulation since 2006. Chantix was the subject of nearly 3,000 lawsuits and eventually pulled off the market in 2021. As new data was gathered, new conclusions were drawn, and a once approved, widely used drug was pulled off the market for the safety of the public. Another example of the evolution of drugs through the collected data is the rise and fall, and rise again, of thalidomide. In 1954, thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant women as a sedative and barbiturate. The drug stayed on the market until the data was conclusive that there were many adverse reactions to the drug, including the deformation of babies' limbs in utero. About 10,000 babies were born with major birth defects due to the drug. In 1965, it was once again back on the market and approved by the FDA as a treatment for ENL lesions. The evolution of thalidomide is an illustration of 2 points that I would like to make. One is that although drugs can be in circulation and considered safe, that's not always the case. Another point is that thalidomide, like many drugs, can be used off-label. This is meaning something different than their original purpose, which is how we have many psychiatric drugs. With enough data collected, new conclusions can be drawn and we can repurpose the drug. Such may be the case for ivermectin. And lastly, the story of thalidomide illustrates the fluidity and transitory nature of what science deems to be safe and effective. Well, there are many more examples like this, such as Johnson & Johnson's baby powder, which isn't a drug but was deemed safe enough to use on babies from 1894 until an investigation in 2019 revealed that its talc and naturally occurring asbestos were not as harmless as they led consumers to believe. These few real-world examples should give merit to the questions that some might have about the safety and efficacy of the current vaccines being mandated. Are they safe long-term? Are they safe? Chantix was safe for 15 years. How long are these vaccines safe for? Another concern that people might have is the POS's narrative that this is a pandemic of the unvaxxed. On an episode of Meet the Press, Dr. Fauci said that this is fundamentally a pandemic of the unvaccinated. This statement is also misleading and in a hyperpolarized climate is dangerous. According to this study in 2021, well, I'll just show them all to you later. About an outbreak of COVID in Massachusetts, about 346 cases that they investigated, 74% of the positive cases were fully vaccinated individuals. Researchers also reported that there were 5 cases of hospitalizations, 4 were fully vaccinated. Another study conducted in 2021, published in The Lancet, found that fully vaccinated individuals can contract and spread COVID to other fully vaccinated individuals in their households, and that the viral load is similar to unvaccinated individuals. While there are other studies and reports, these studies alone should be acknowledged by the POS. If vaccinated individuals can still get COVID and still be hospitalized with COVID, as these studies confirm, then the statement that this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated is either willfully ignorant or a blatant lie, once again calling into question the integrity of the POS. This is dangerous because it gives vaccinated individuals the false belief that they cannot get or be hospitalized with COVID after vaccination, which might lead them to take uninformed risks. The misinformation that's being presented on the behalf of science could lead to massive unintended consequences for discrimination against unvaccinated individuals, as we're seeing in Austria, Australia, Germany, and this list is updating as I speak. This false statement is leading to a loss of freedom for individuals who claim bodily autonomy. One aspect of the intellectual warfare is defined in neglected perspectives is attempts to influence the flow of information through propaganda, outright distortions and lies, control of the media, and censorship. Recently, Dr. Peter Doshi, who's a professor and senior editor at the BMJ, testified on Capitol Hill. In the beginning of November, Dr. Doshi testified in front of Congress reviewing the trial data of the COVID vaccine. Even with his scientific credentials, this testimony was removed from social media platforms, banned from YouTube, and nearly impossible to find on the internet. This should concern everyone in the scientific community. This person has earned their place in science and is being labeled as misinformation. Censoring scientists is antithetical to science, and that we should be outraged and scared. According to neglected perspectives, the loss of the ability to criticize religion and science would be amount to intellectual death. I presented studies and data that show that there's a reasonable doubt of the safety and efficacy of these current generation of vaccines. However, if there were few adverse reactions, and there are more than a few according to VAERS, even if there were, would a flat mandate be ethical? This question reminds me of one of the few participants in Stanley Milgram's obedience study who refused to continue when the learner raised objections. Surely you've considered the ethics of this thing here. He doesn't want to go on, and you think the experiment is more important? Have you examined him? Do you know what physical state he is? Say this man had a weak heart. This quote is especially fitting in this circumstance, as there have been cases of myocarditis, a heart condition triggered by this generation of COVID vaccine. It takes years to know what different medical treatments can do to your body over time, as referenced by Chantix, thalidomide, and baby powder, and mandating that all persons be vaccinated, else not work, travel, or go to school is unethical. All medical procedures should be considered by the patient and doctor only. Referring to the studies I have cited, it is not a pandemic of the unvaccinated. According to peer-reviewed studies, vaccinated individuals can still get, spread, and go to the hospital due to COVID. Therefore, unvaccinated individuals are no more harmful to society than vaccinated individuals. However, the risks are being ignored by the POS do pose a legitimate threat to otherwise healthy individuals who would have to weigh the option of their cost-benefit analysis and not be subjected to forced inoculation that may hurt them more than it helps them. The exclusion of data, the censoring of scientists, the intellectual warfare use of accepted derogatory language to denigrate persons who disagree is sowing distrust in science and all vaccines. Whether you agree with this vaccine or not, discrimination is discrimination. And this is why I'm choosing to be disobedient. This is why I'm choosing to voice my dissent. Allowing the government to assume responsibility for our health and our body could result in a total totalitarian state. Agreeing to this request, no matter how appropriate it might seem at the time, will set precedents that will now be admissible. While people were mandated before to get public vaccines to go to public school, this has never been the case to go to work. I've never had to show my medical card to get a job, get on an airplane, or walk into a business. Once this precedent is set, it will stay. I'm not an expert in anything, and I never claimed to be. I'm limited by my lack of knowledge and understanding of just about everything. However, I know I can't teach my students about Milgram and Zimbardo and ASH and think that I would have been the ones to speak up for myself and stand up for myself if I don't take this stance now. How can I teach about the destructive consequences of obedience to authority while quietly allowing the world to descend into an authoritarian state? Now they're coming for the unvaxxed. What public health emergency scapegoats will they come for next? And after that, and after that. This is why I'm standing up and speaking out. This is my Milgram moment, and I choose disobedience. Sorry, and I needed to.
We're running time, so just a moment for questions.
This is not a question, but just kind of a follow-up point. When looking at the transparency of making informed decisions off of evidence available, the FDA has just recently announced that it would take about 55 years to fulfill a FOIA request, looking at the data for the original vaccine development.
Which is just wild to me, because we all do studies here, right? Can you imagine being like, I have the most amazing results from my study. Oh, cool. Can we see your work? Show us your data? No.
55 years.
55 years. We never get published. Also, you're supposed to have consent forms, right? This is a medical experiment. I should have free, informed consent, which is also not happening if there's mandates. I think it's a slippery slope, and it's scaring the shit out of me right now, honestly, and I just couldn't keep it in any longer, and I have no one to talk to, so thank you for granting me this space to get things off my chest that I haven't been able to talk about.
Thank you, we'll be right here. So we may have to relaunch the system.
Would you let me borrow this until next Thursday?
Yeah, ma'am.
Thank you.
And I think you want me to, are you already hooked in?
It's really good.
Okay.
It's a good read, too. It's easy to read.
oh,
Yeah, it's good. You'll like it.
Believe. You may need to, yes, there we go.
Never in the wrong spot.
All right, well, I thought my topic was going to be a little controversial.
You're welcome.
You've emboldened me. At the same time, this is probably going to be kind of a snooze fest, so I apologize. All right. So, psychological assessment. Is this going to work for me?